The year was 1871, when the western frontier still promised both opportunity and peril to those brave enough to seek their fortune beyond the Mississippi. For those who ventured across the endless plains of Montana Territory, dreams could flourish, or perish in equal measure, often determined by nothing more than cruel chance. This is the story of Abigail Hawkins, who escaped death by finding shelter in the most dangerous place imaginable, and the Lakota tracker, River Wolf, whose decision to follow her trail would forever alter both their destinies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abigail Hawkins had never wanted to go west. At 22, she had built a comfortable life teaching at the small schoolhouse in rural Pennsylvania, living in the room above the town's modest library where she could indulge her passion for literature after her students had gone home. But when consumption claimed her mother and left her father, James Hawkins, with mounting debts and painful memories, the promise of free land under the Homestead Act proved too tempting to resist. Montana has the richest soil in the country, her father had insisted, eyes bright with a hope she hadn't seen since before her mother's illness. We can start fresh, build something that's truly ours. So Abigail had reluctantly packed her few belongings, her mother's silver hairbrush, 3 cherished books, and the journal she'd kept since childhood, and joined the Whitewater expedition, 15 wagons strong, bound for the Gallatin Valley. The journey had been arduous, but uneventful. For the first 6 weeks, the expedition leader, Vernon Whitewater, was experienced and cautious, choosing campsites with access to water and good visibility. The travelers formed a loose community, sharing meals and stories around evening fires, speculating about the new lives awaiting them. Abigail even found herself enjoying the endless sky and the ever-changing landscape, so different from the dense forests of Pennsylvania. It was the early morning of October 12th when everything changed. Abigail had risen before dawn, unable to sleep on the hard ground. She wandered a short distance from camp to gather kindling for the morning fires, careful to stay within sight of the wagons circled near the base of a small rocky hill. The first shot cracked through the dawn stillness like thunder. For a moment, Abigail stood frozen, the bundle of sticks clutched to her chest. Then came a chorus of gunfire, followed by screams that turned her blood to ice. Instinct took over. Abigail dropped the kindling and flattened herself against the damp earth. Years of accompanying her father on hunting expeditions had taught her to move silently through woodland. Now, as shouts and screams filled the air, she crawled through the tall buffalo grass away from the chaos, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. From her position in the grass, she could see figures moving among the wagons, men on horseback, faces obscured by scarves, methodically shooting anyone who tried to flee. The Whitewater expedition, with its dreams of new beginnings, was being systematically destroyed. Abigail watched in silent horror as Vernon Whitewater emerged from his wagon with a rifle, only to be cut down before he could fire a single shot. She saw the Miller children, 8-year-old twins she'd been teaching their letters just the evening before, running in terror before falling still. And her father, James Hawkins, died trying to protect Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who had shared her dried apple tarts with everyone in the convoy. The raiders worked with chilling efficiency, shooting the men first, then methodically eliminating women and children. When they finished, they dismounted and began ransacking the wagons, taking valuables and supplies, occasionally pausing to fire a bullet into anyone who still showed signs of life. As they worked, snatches of their conversation drifted to where Abigail lay trembling in the grass. Best haul yet. Too close to Lakota territory. Blame will fall on them. The sun had fully risen by the time the raiders departed, leaving behind the smoldering remains of the Whitewater expedition. Abigail remained motionless long after the hoofbeats faded, terror and disbelief keeping her pinned to the ground. Eventually, the October chill penetrated her shock, and she realized she needed to move. Rising slowly, her limbs stiff from hours of immobility, Abigail surveyed the devastation. The wagons had been partially burned, their contents scattered across the campsite. Bodies lay where they had fallen, friends and strangers who just hours before had been discussing their hopes for the future. And among them, her father, face down, in the dirt, his back riddled with bullets. Grief threatened to overwhelm her, but survival instinct kept her moving. The raiders had been thorough in their destruction, but Abigail managed to salvage a few essential items: a canteen only partially emptied, a small hunting knife her father had insisted she carry, a woolen blanket that had been trampled into, the mud but was still serviceable, and a pouch containing some dried beef and hard biscuits that had spilled from one of the food crates. Looking around the massacre site, Abigail tried to orient herself. The Whitewater expedition had been following the Jefferson River, heading northwest toward the Gallatin Valley. But in which direction was the river now? The rising sun indicated east, so the river should be west. Her mind felt clouded, unable to process simple geography through the haze of trauma. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice strange. In the terrible silence, just keep moving. But toward what? Abigail had only the vaguest understanding of where they had been in relation to any settlement or fort. Vernon Whitewater had mentioned Fort Ellis was their destination, but how far away was it, and in which direction? Choosing west, simply because it felt right, Abigail began walking. Each step was an effort, her body protesting both the physical exertion and the emotional weight she carried. Her boots, comfortable enough for riding in the wagon, but wholly inadequate for serious walking, soon raised blisters that burst and bled with every step. The Montana landscape, which had seemed so majestic from the safety of the wagon train, now felt vast and threatening. The October wind cut through her dress and woolen shawl, carrying the promise of an early winter. Abigail knew enough about frontier life to understand that without shelter, the cold could kill her as surely as the raiders' bullets. As the day wore on, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. By mid-afternoon, they had blotted out the sun, and the first drops of icy rain began to fall. Abigail's pace slowed as her clothing became sodden and heavy, dragging at her already exhausted body. The rain increased in intensity, pounding against her as if nature itself sought to drive her to her knees. Through the curtain of water, Abigail spotted a rock formation on a nearby hillside that might offer some protection. Altering her course, she stumbled toward it, no longer able to feel. Her feet, her hands blue with cold. The formation turned out to be the entrance to a small cave, little more than an indentation in the hillside. But it was a shelter, and Abigail crawled gratefully into its shadows. The interior was surprisingly deep, extending perhaps 15 feet into the hill and mercifully dry. Stripping off her sodden outer garments, Abigail wrapped herself in the damp but still warming woolen blanket. She arranged her wet clothing nearby, hoping it might dry somewhat overnight, and allowed herself a small sip from the canteen and a few bites of the dried beef. Outside, the storm intensified, sheets of rain turning the ground to mud, lightning occasionally illuminating the cave entrance. Abigail huddled deeper into the darkness, seeking warmth where there was none. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by images of the morning's horror. She awoke to silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystal-clear dawn that belied the devastation of the previous day. Abigail's clothing had dried somewhat, though it remained stiff with dirt and other stains. Her body ached all over, and her feet, when she examined them, were a mess of torn skin and dried blood. After another small drink and a few bites of food, Abigail crawled to the cave entrance to assess her situation. The rain had obscured any tracks she might have left, which she decided was a blessing. If the raiders returned to ensure they'd left no witnesses, they would find no trail leading from the massacre site. As she prepared to leave the cave and continue her journey, though to where, she still wasn't certain, a sound from deeper within the cavern froze her in place. A rustling, followed by a low, rumbling growl that sent primal fear coursing through her veins. Slowly, dreading what she might see, Abigail turned back toward the darkness of the cave. As her eyes adjusted, a massive form took shape, a grizzly bear, disturbed from its early winter rest by the human intruder who had unknowingly sought shelter in its den. The bear rose on its hind legs, towering over her, its hot breath visible in the chill morning air. Abigail remained perfectly still, not even daring to blink as the creature studied her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "If you ever meet a bear, girl, don't run. That makes you prey." Time seemed to stretch as Abigail faced the bear, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Then, unexpectedly, the massive animal dropped back to all fours, gave another warning growl, and moved toward the cave entrance. Abigail pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible as the bear lumbered past, close enough that she could smell its musky odor and feel the heat radiating from its body. Once outside, the bear paused, silhouetted against the morning light, then disappeared down the hillside. Abigail slumped to the ground, her legs no longer able to support her. When she had recovered enough to think clearly, Abigail realized her inadvertent choice of shelter might have saved her life in more ways than one. The cave, while dangerous, had protected her from both the storm and potential pursuit, and now it offered her a difficult but potentially life-saving decision. The bear had gone, but it would return. This was its den, prepared for the coming winter. If Abigail left, she faced an uncertain journey through unfamiliar territory, weakened by injury and shock, with minimal supplies. If she stayed, she might avoid the immediate dangers of exposure and starvation, but would eventually confront the returning bear. The decision was made for her when she tried to stand and found her injured feet would no longer support her weight. The blisters had become infected overnight, turning the torn skin an angry red with worrying streaks extending upward. Fever made her thoughts sluggish and her vision blurry. "I'll rest," she murmured to herself. "Just until tomorrow." Tomorrow became the next day, and then the next, as fever held Abigail in its grip. She drifted in and out of consciousness, conserving her dwindling supplies as best she could, drinking from a small puddle of rainwater that had formed just inside the cave entrance. In her lucid moments, Abigail realized the bear had not returned. Perhaps it had another den nearby, or perhaps it had sensed her presence and decided to abandon this one. Either way, its absence was a small mercy in her desperate situation. By the 5th day after the massacre, Abigail's fever had broken, but she was desperately weak. Her food was gone, and the water puddle had dried up. She knew she needed to leave the cave or die there, regardless of her injured feet. Using her father's hunting knife, she cut strips from the bottom of her petticoat to bind her feet as best she could. Then, leaning heavily on a sturdy branch she'd found near the cave entrance, she began her painful journey once more. The landscape seemed both familiar and alien as Abigail hobbled forward. Had she been traveling in circles? Was she heading back toward the massacre site? The thought filled her with dread, but she pressed on, having no better option. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the rolling prairie, Abigail spotted a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. But who? The raiders? Friendly settlers? Native hunters? She hesitated, uncertain whether to approach or avoid the smoke. Death might await her either way. From violence if she encountered enemies, from exposure and starvation if she didn't. Deciding that a quick death might be preferable to the slow one that currently claimed her, Abigail altered her course toward the smoke. Her progress was agonizingly slow, each step sending waves of pain through her infected feet. By the time the sun began to set, she had drawn close enough to make out a small camp, a single fire with what appeared to be one or two figures moving. Around it, what she didn't notice was the figure watching her from a ridge nearly a quarter-mile away. A solitary observer who had been tracking her halting progress since midday, reading the story of her desperate journey in the uneven gait and stumbling footprints. Riverwolf lowered his brass spyglass and frowned thoughtfully. The woman was heading straight toward a camp that belonged to a notorious fur trapper, whose treatment of both native women and the land itself had earned him enemies throughout the territory. She was walking from one death into another. He slipped. The spyglass, acquired years ago in trade for 3 perfect buffalo hides, into the leather pouch at his waist and considered his options. The white woman was clearly a survivor of something terrible. Her clothing was torn and stained, her movement indicated injury, and she traveled alone in territory where no white woman would journey without protection. River Wolf had been following the trail of a small elk herd when he discovered the massacre site 3 days earlier. The brutality of the attack had immediately told him it wasn't the work of any native tribe. The bodies had been stripped of valuables, but left otherwise intact. No tribe would waste such resources, even of their enemies. This was the work of white men preying on their own kind. He had found the woman's trail leading away from the site, small footprints, uneven and wavering, clearly made by someone injured and terrified. Following her hadn't been a conscious decision, so much as an extension of his curiosity about who could have survived such an assault. Now, watching her stumble toward danger, River Wolf knew he had a choice to make. Leave her to her fate. After all, she was not his concern, not his people, or intervene in ways that could bring him nothing but trouble. The white man's justice rarely distinguished between hostile and friendly natives when incidents occurred. As the sun sank lower, painting the western sky in fierce oranges and reds, River Wolf made his decision. Whatever his reasons, even he wasn't entirely certain of them. He could not watch another innocent die while he stood by. Adjusting the rifle slung across his back, he began to move, knowing that both their fates had just become intertwined in ways neither could yet understand. Abigail's vision blurred as she stumbled forward through the golden prairie grass. The distant campfire was her only beacon in the gathering dusk. Each step sent waves of pain through her infected feet, and she clutched her father's hunting knife more for comfort than protection. The small blade offered little reassurance against the vastness of the Montana wilderness, but it was all she had left of her previous life. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mingling with another scent that made her empty stomach clench painfully. Roasting meat. She paused at the edge of a small clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of stunted junipers. Through the branches, she could make out a crude camp, a canvas tent, a small fire, and a single figure moving about. He was a large man with a wild beard and clothing that seemed pieced together from various animal hides. A rifle leaned against a nearby log, close enough for him to grab it quickly. As Abigail watched, he turned the spit over the fire, revealing what appeared to be a rabbit cooking slowly over the flames. Something about the man set alarm bells ringing in her mind. Perhaps it was the methodical way he moved, reminiscent of the raider's efficiency, or the collection of animal traps piled near his tent, cruel-looking devices with vicious metal teeth. Before she could decide whether to approach or retreat, the man's head suddenly snapped up, his gaze directed toward her hiding place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. River was not in the camp. Panic fluttered in her chest until she noticed that his pack and weapons were still present. He hadn't abandoned her. Pushing herself to a sitting position, Abigail took stock of her situation. Her dress was beyond repair, torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her hair hung in tangled knots around her face. But she was alive, and for the first time since the massacre, she felt a spark of hope that she might remain so. River returned shortly, carrying several bulbous roots and a handful of berries. "You wake," he observed. "Good. Body needs food too. A fight sickness." "Where did you go?" Abigail asked, accepting the berries he offered. "To find food. Check for bad men." He knelt by the fire, adding small twigs to coax the embers back to life. They search but go the wrong way, south. He placed the roots near the growing flames. At Abigail's questioning look, he explained, "Prairie turnip. Good food. Medicine too." As the roots cooked, River produced a small clay pot from his pack and mixed water with some kind of dried herb. The resulting paste he offered to Abigail, along with a questioning look. She hesitated only briefly before extending her arm, revealing a deep scratch she'd received during her frantic crawl away from the massacre site. The wound had begun to show angry red lines extending outward, another infection taking hold. River nodded grimly and began applying the paste with surprisingly gentle fingers. "Infection spreads," he explained. "This will fight, but I need more. Have medicine at my camp." He finished treating her wound and sat back. "Can you walk today?" Abigail flexed her feet experimentally, assessing the pain. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. He studied her face. "For me, 1. For you?" The implied challenge in his words sparked something in Abigail, a stubborn pride she had nearly forgotten during her days of desperate flight. "I can keep up," she stated firmly, meeting his gaze. The hint of a smile ghosted across River's face. "We see. They ate the prairie turnips along with more of the dried meat." The food, simple as it was, restored some of Abigail's strength, though she knew it would take more than 1 meal to recover from her ordeal. As they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, Abigail found herself confronting a reality she'd been too exhausted to fully consider the night before. She was placing her trust, her life, in the hands of a man whose people were often portrayed as savages in the stories told around settler campfires. "Why did you help me?" she asked again as River extinguished the fire with handfuls of dirt. "The truth this time." River paused, regarding her with those unfathomable dark eyes. "Truth has many sides," he said after a moment, "like river stones." He seemed to debate with himself before continuing. "I follow the tracks from the wagon place. See you are alone, hunted." His expression hardened. "Those men, they kill my people too. Say Lakota did it. Use fear of my people to hide their crimes." Abigail frowned, understanding dawning. "You were tracking them, the raiders," River nodded once. "For many moons they raid, they kill, they blame my people. Then white soldiers come, punish innocent villages." He shouldered his pack. "You are a witness. You saw the truth. Maybe one day you will speak this truth." The weight of his words settled over Abigail. She had never considered the consequences of false attribution of attacks. How many innocent people on both sides had died because of such deceptions? "I will," she promised, her voice strengthening with resolve. "If I live to tell it." "You live," River said with quiet certainty. "Now we go." They set off heading northwest, River setting a pace that was challenging but not impossible. Abigail's feet, wrapped in fresh bandages and protected by soft-soled moccasins River had produced from his pack, supported her weight much better than she had expected. The herbal paste seemed to be working, reducing both the pain and the heat of infection. They spoke little as they traveled, conversation limited to practical matters, warnings about terrain, brief rests for water, instructions on which plants to avoid. By midday, Abigail's body had settled into the rhythm of the journey, the consistent movement actually easing some of the stiffness from her muscles. She found herself studying River as they walked, the efficient grace of his movements, the constant awareness he maintained of their surroundings, the way he seemed to read the landscape like a book written in a language only he understood. "You speak English well," she observed during a brief rest beside a small creek. River gave her an appraising look, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Lived at mission school 4 winters, learned white man's words, white man's God." He dipped, his hand in the creek letting the water flow through his fingers. "Learned how white men think, useful knowledge." "But you left," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. Mission wants Lakota to become white inside. Forget old ways. He touched the small beaded pouch at his belt. Some ways should not be forgotten. Abigail thought of her own education in Pennsylvania, where she had been taught that civilization was a gift being bestowed upon the savage races of the frontier. Now, facing the reality of the West, she wondered which world was truly savage. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the rolling prairie. Twice, River froze in mid-step, signaling for Abigail to be still. Each time, after long moments of listening, he would relax slightly and gesture for them to proceed. She never asked what he had heard or sensed. Some things were better left unknown in this vast wilderness. As dusk approached, they reached a series of low hills, dotted with pine and cedar. River led her to a sheltered hollow, where a natural spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool before trickling away downstream. "Rest here," he announced, shedding his pack. "Good water hidden." Abigail sank gratefully to the ground, removing her moccasins to examine her feet. The herbal paste had worked surprisingly well. The angry red streaks were fading, and new skin was beginning to form over the worst of the blisters. She dipped her feet in the cool spring water, sighing at the relief it brought. River watched her for a moment, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. He returned shortly with a handful of broad leaves and some white chalky stones. Crouching beside the spring, he crushed the stones to powder and mixed it with the masticated leaves. "For feet," he explained, offering the mixture to her. "Will draw pain, help skin grow strong." Abigail applied the paste to her damaged feet, marveling at the almost immediate cooling sensation that dulled the throbbing pain. "You know a great deal about healing," she observed. River arranged firewood in a small pit he dug, careful to minimize visible smoke. "My grandmother was a medicine woman, taught me plants, healing ways before soldiers took me to mission school." "Your grandmother, is she still alive?" A shadow crossed his face. "No. Sickness came to winter camp 3 seasons past. Many died. Grandmother is too old to fight it." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, recognizing the loss reflected in his eyes. "My mother died of consumption last year. That's partly why we were heading west. My father thought a fresh start would help us both heal." River nodded, understanding in his expression. Death walks with all people, white or Lakota, no difference in grief. As darkness settled fully around them, River built their fire up just enough to provide warmth without creating a beacon for anyone who might be tracking them. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and wild onions River had gathered during the day's journey. "How much farther to your camp?" Abigail asked as they finished eating. "1 more day, maybe 2. River gestured vaguely northwest. "Depends on your strength and your people. Will they welcome me?" The question had been troubling her since she realized their destination. River's expression turned grave. "Some yes, some no." He prodded the fire with a stick, sending a brief flurry of sparks upward. "Chief Greyhawk is a wise man, but cautious with white people, too many broken promises." "I'm hardly in a position to break promises," Abigail said with a wry smile. "I have nothing left to give or take." "Truth," he acknowledged. "But prepare for a difficult welcome. Stay close to me." They lapsed into silence, each lost in private thoughts as the fire burned low. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail found sleep elusive. The events of the past week replayed in her mind, the massacre, her desperate flight, the encounter with the trapper, and now this unlikely alliance with a Lakota tracker. In the flickering, a firelight, she studied River's profile as he kept watch. There was a stillness to him, a self-contained quality that seemed born of deep wisdom rather than simple reticence. He was nothing like the bloodthirsty savages she had been warned about all her life, yet he was definitely not a man to be trifled with either. "Stay down!" River commanded, notching an arrow to his bow in one fluid motion. Abigail pressed herself against the ground, heart hammering in her chest. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Their attacker was moving toward them, using the scattered rocks for cover. River waited, utterly still, listening. When a shadow moved between two boulders 20 yards away, he released his arrow. There was a grunt of pain, followed by a stream of curses. The arrow had found its mark, but not fatally. "Who's with you, Injun?" A rough voice called out. "Saw? 2 figures on the ridge." River remained silent, moving silently to another position. He gestured for Abigail to stay hidden, then disappeared among the rocks. The wounded man continued shouting. "Got one of your women with you? Or maybe something more interesting?" A chill ran down Abigail's spine as she realized he was trying to determine if she was the survivor from the wagon train. She clutched her knife, though it would be little protection against a rifle. The standoff continued for long minutes, the wounded scout alternating between taunts and pained breathing. From below, shouts indicated that the men in the camp had heard the gunfire and were preparing to investigate. River reappeared beside Abigail, materializing so silently she nearly cried out in surprise. "Must go," he whispered urgently. "More. Will come soon. Follow me." Keeping low, they began retreating along the ridge, using the rocky terrain for cover. Behind them, the scout had begun calling to his companions, directing them toward the ridge. "There!" The shout came from below, followed by more gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off rocks around them as they ran, crouching, toward the far end of the ridge. "Their path down," River said, pointing to a nearly invisible game trail that descended steeply through a series of switchbacks. "Go first. I follow. But go!" The intensity in his voice brooked no argument. Abigail began the treacherous descent, her healing feet protesting the strain of navigating the steep, unstable path. Behind her, River moved backward, bow ready, watching for pursuers. More shots rang out, but the distance and fading light made accuracy impossible. Still, it was only a matter of time before the raiders reached the ridgetop and gained clear sightlines to the trail. Halfway down, disaster struck. A rock shifted beneath Abigail's foot, sending her sliding down the steep incline. She tumbled, painfully for several yards, before managing to catch herself on an outcropping, gasping as sharp stones cut into her palms. River was beside her in an instant, helping her to her feet. "Can you continue?" Abigail tested her weight. Nothing seemed broken, though new bruises were already forming. "Yes, I'm fine." They resumed their descent, more carefully now. Above them, voices indicated the raiders had reached the ridgetop and spotted them on the trail. Just as they reached the bottom of the slope, a bullet struck the ground at their feet. The raiders were taking aim from above. "Run," River urged, pushing Abigail toward the cover of trees at the valley's edge. "Forest will hide us." They sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt around them. The tree line seemed impossibly distant, a green haven that retreated with each desperate stride. As they finally reached the sheltering forest, Abigail heard River grunt in pain. He stumbled slightly but kept moving, urging her deeper among the trees. "You're hit," she gasped, seeing the blood spreading across his upper arm. "Keep moving," he insisted through gritted teeth. "Just grazed. Hunters will follow." They plunged deeper into the forest as twilight settled around them, the sounds of pursuit gradually receding as darkness made tracking nearly impossible. Still, River pushed on, leading them through increasingly dense undergrowth until they reached a small clearing dominated by a massive oak. "Climb," he instructed, gesturing to the tree's lower branches. "Safer above ground tonight." Despite her exhaustion and the pain from her fall, Abigail managed to pull herself up into the tree's embrace. River followed, his movements more labored than usual, confirming her suspicion that his wound was worse than he had admitted. Once they reached a sturdy branch some 15 feet above the ground, concealed by the oak's thick canopy, River finally allowed himself to rest. He leaned back against the trunk, his breathing ragged. "Let me see your arm," Abigail insisted, already tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage. River acquiesced without argument, a sign that the injury was indeed causing him significant pain. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his upper arm, narrowly missing the bone but tearing through muscle. Blood flowed steadily from the wound. Working by the dim light filtering through the leaves, Abigail cleaned the injury as best she could with water from River's skin. Then, following his murmured instructions, she applied a poultice of herbs from his medicine pouch before binding the wound tightly. "Good," he said when she finished, though his face was drawn with pain. "You learn quick." "I've had an excellent teacher," Abigail replied, settling beside him on the branch. "Will they find us here?" River shook his head slightly. "Not in the dark, but in the morning." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Their situation was precarious at best. "How far is your camp now?" "Half-day's walk," he said, gesturing vaguely northward. "If the path is clear." A big if, given the raiders' presence and the cavalry patrol they'd encountered earlier. Abigail felt fear threatening to overwhelm her again, the same paralyzing terror she'd experienced watching the massacre of her wagon train. "We'll make it," she said with more confidence than she felt, as much to reassure herself as River. "We've come too far to fail now." River studied her face in the gathering darkness, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "You have a warrior spirit," he observed, "like a bear in a cave, wounded but still dangerous." The comparison to the grizzly whose den she had inadvertently shared brought an unexpected smile to Abigail's face. "I don't feel very dangerous," she admitted. "Best warriors never do," River replied, his voice growing fainter as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. "Feel fear, but act with courage anyway." He slumped a little more against the trunk, his eyes drifting closed despite his obvious efforts to stay alert. "Sleep," Abigail urged, touching his unwounded arm gently. "I'll keep watch." River hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Wake me if anything moves," he murmured. Within moments his breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Alone in the darkness, Abigail maintained her vigil. The night forest came alive around her. Owl calls, the distant howl of wolves, the rustling of nocturnal creatures on the forest floor below. Each sound initially sent a jolt of fear through her, but as the hours passed, she began to distinguish between the natural symphony of the wilderness and anything that might signal danger. Looking at River's sleeping form, vulnerable now in a way she hadn't seen before, Abigail was struck by how much had changed in the few days since he had found her. He had saved her life, certainly, but he had also shown her a way of seeing the world that challenged everything she had been raised to believe. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever awaited them at the Lakota camp, Abigail knew with sudden clarity that she had already been transformed. The schoolteacher's daughter from Pennsylvania was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had faced death and survived, someone who now understood that the lines between civilized and savage were far more blurred than she had ever imagined. Natu, as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Abigail made a silent promise to herself. If they reached the Lakota camp, when they reached it, she would use her voice to speak the truth, no matter what it cost her. It was the least she could do to honor both her father's memory and the man who had risked everything to save a stranger. Dawn broke with a cold clarity that painted the forest in shades of mist and shadow. Abigail gently touched River's shoulder, careful to avoid his wound. He woke instantly, fully alert despite his injury. "No trouble?" he asked, scanning the area below. "Nothing," Abigail confirmed. The night was quiet. River nodded approvingly. "Good eyes, good ears." He examined his bandaged arm, flexing it experimentally and wincing slightly at the movement. "We will move soon. Raiders start tracking at first light." They descended from their arboreal sanctuary. With caution, River moving more stiffly than usual but refusing to show any sign of weakness. On the ground, he oriented himself quickly, pointing north through the densest part of the forest. This way, harder path, better hiding. They traveled in silence through the morning hours, River setting a pace that challenged Abigail's endurance, but remained within her capabilities. The forest gradually changed character, the pines giving way to more diverse growth, aspen, cottonwood, and occasional clearings filled with late-blooming wildflowers. Around midday, they paused beside a small stream. River knelt, not to drink, but to study something in the soft earth at the water's edge. "What is it?" Abigail asked, noticing the sudden tension in his posture. "Tracks," he replied, pointing to impressions she could barely distinguish from the surrounding mud. "Lakota hunters, fresh, made this morning. Your people? That's good news, isn't it?" River's expression remained guarded. "Maybe, or maybe scouts who don't know me." He straightened, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "We continue, more careful now." They forded the shallow stream, using the water to mask their trail for several hundred yards before emerging onto rocky ground that would leave minimal traces of their passage. River's vigilance had intensified, his gaze constantly sweeping their surroundings, his hand never far from his knife. As they entered a small clearing edged with aspen trees, River suddenly froze, raising his hand in warning. Abigail stopped, immediately straining to detect what had alerted him. Then she heard it, a soft whistle from the trees ahead. Not a bird call, but clearly a signal. River responded with a similar whistle, followed by words in Lakota that carried through the clearing. For a tense moment, silence was the only response. Then 3 figures emerged from the tree line, Lakota warriors with bows drawn and arrows pointed directly at them. The center figure, taller than his companions with a face painted in red and black stripes, barked a question at River. River answered calmly, his hands held slightly away from his weapons in a non-threatening gesture. The exchange continued for several tense moments, voices low, but the intensity clear even to Abigail, who couldn't understand the words. Finally, the tall warrior lowered his bow slightly, though his companions maintained their aim. He switched to heavily accented English, directing his words at Abigail. "Why did you come here, white woman?" Abigail took a single step forward, grateful that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I survived a massacre. River saved my life." The warrior's eyes narrowed. "Massacre by who?" "White men. Raiders who attack both your people and mine, then blame Indians for their crimes." A flicker of surprise crossed the warrior's face before his expression hardened again. "You saw this?" "Yes," Abigail confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "I saw everything. I can testify to the truth." The 3 warriors exchanged glances. The tall one spoke again to River, who nodded and replied. After another moment of consideration, the warrior gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. "Chief must hear this," he said. "You come." But his gaze fixed on Abigail with unmistakable warning. "You walk with covered eyes." River turned to Abigail, his expression conveying the seriousness of the situation. "For protection, they fear you will learn a path to the village." "I understand," Abigail said, though the prospect of being blindfolded in unfamiliar territory sent a surge of anxiety through her. The tall warrior produced a strip of woven cloth. River took it from him and approached Abigail. "Trust me," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "No harm comes while I guide." Abigail nodded, closing her eyes, as he placed the cloth over them, tying it securely at the back of her head. The sudden darkness was disorienting, heightening her other senses. The scent of pine and wild sage, the sound of wind through branches, the murmur of voices in a language she couldn't understand. She felt River's hand close around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "I lead, step where I step." They began to move forward, Abigail placing her trust entirely in River's guidance. It was perhaps the most vulnerable she had been since the massacre, unable to see, surrounded by those who might wish her harm, in territory utterly unknown to her. The journey through darkness seemed endless. Abigail concentrated on the pressure of River's hand guiding her, the sound of his voice occasionally murmuring instructions: "Step high here, duck branches, careful stones," the only constants in her blindfolded world. The voices of the warriors surrounded her, their Lakota language flowing like water over rocks, sometimes sharp with what sounded like disagreement, other times low and urgent. When they finally stopped, she could sense a change in the air, smoke from cooking fires, the distant sound of voices and movement, the barking of dogs. They had reached the Lakota camp. "Ready?" River asked quietly near her ear. Abigail nodded, her throat too dry for words. The blindfold was removed, and she blinked against the late afternoon light, taking in her surroundings. The Lakota summer camp spread before her in a sheltered valley, perhaps 25 teepees arranged in a rough circle, some painted with vivid designs that seemed to tell stories she couldn't read. Cook fires flickered throughout the camp, sending thin columns of smoke into the clear sky. Children paused in their play to stare at the newcomers. Women stood from their work, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Men approached, with hands resting on weapons. River stood tall beside her, his face composed but alert. The tall warrior who had confronted them in the forest moved ahead, calling out to the gathering crowd. A ripple of reaction passed through the assembly. Surprise, anger, suspicion. A path cleared through the people as an elderly man emerged from the largest teepee at the center of the camp. His face was deeply lined with age, his long gray hair bound with a single eagle feather. Despite his years, he moved with the straight-backed dignity of one accustomed to authority. "Chief Grey Hawk," River said under his breath. "Show respect. Do not speak until spoken to." The chief approached slowly, his dark eyes taking in every detail of Abigail's appearance, the torn and stained dress, the tangled hair, the mixture of fear and determination in her stance. He spoke in Lakota to River, who responded at length, occasionally gesturing toward Abigail or in the direction from which they had traveled. Abigail stood silently, acutely aware of the stares from all sides. Children whispered behind their hands, nudged by mothers into silence. Young warriors watched with undisguised suspicion. A few of the older women studied her with expressions that seemed more calculating than hostile. Finally, Chief Grey Hawk turned his attention fully to Abigail, addressing her in halting but understandable English. "River says you survive when all others die, says you witness the truth of who kills your people." "Yes," Abigail replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I saw everything. It was white men, raiders pretending to be Indians. They've been raiding both settler wagons and native villages, stirring hatred between our peoples." The chief's weathered face remained impassive. "Why should we believe white? Woman's words? White tongues often speak lies about Lakota." Abigail felt the weight of every eye upon her. This moment Her response would determine not just her welcome, but possibly her survival. The truth was all she had to offer. "I have no reason to lie," she said. "I've lost everything, my father, my possessions, my future in Montana Territory. The men who destroyed all that are still out there, free to continue their crimes against both our peoples. If I wanted to blame your people for the massacre, I would have gone to the soldiers we saw yesterday." Greyhawk studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and spoke at length to a small group of older men who had gathered behind him. Council members, Abigail guessed, by their attentive posture and the respect shown to them by others. One of them, a man with a deeply scarred face and only one eye, spoke forcefully, gesturing toward Abigail with obvious disapproval. Another, wearing an elaborate necklace of bear claws, seemed to argue in her favor, pointing to River's wounded arm and then to the medicine pouch at his belt. The debate continued as darkness fell completely over the camp. More torches were lit, casting flickering shadows across the gathered faces. Abigail stood motionless beside River, determined not to show the exhaustion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, Chief Greyhawk raised his hand, silencing the council's discussion. He turned back to Abigail and River. "Woman will stay," he announced. 3 days. Council hears the full story tomorrow when sun high." He pointed to a small teepee at the edge of the camp. "Stay there, watched always." With that, he turned and walked back toward the central teepee, the council members following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, though many continued to cast curious or hostile glances toward Abigail. "Good outcome," River said quietly as they began walking toward the designated teepee. "Better than expected." "Being watched at all times is good," Abigail whispered back, uncertainty coloring her voice. "Not killing immediately is good," River replied with unexpected frankness. "Rest. We talk more later." The small teepee was sparsely furnished. 2 sleeping pallets of pine boughs covered with buffalo robes, a central fire pit, a few clay vessels for water. A young woman entered shortly after them, silently placing a wooden bowl of stew and a water skin near the fire before departing without meeting Abigail's eyes. "Who was that?" Abigail asked, sinking gratefully onto one of the pallets as her legs finally gave way beneath her. "Mourning Dove." "My sister's daughter," River explained, sitting across from her. He winced slightly as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "She is curious about you. She didn't look at me. Lakota way. Watch without seeming to watch." A hint of amusement touched his expression. "Women in my family see everything." Abigail managed a tired smile at that. "Women everywhere see everything. Men just don't notice us." This drew a small chuckle from River, a sound Abigail realized she had never heard from him before. The brief moment of lightness felt precious amid the tension of their situation. They ate the stew, a rich mixture of venison, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots, in companionable silence. Abigail found herself studying the interior of the teepee, noting the craftsmanship of the structure, the practical arrangement of the sparse belongings. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked finally. "Council meets. You tell a story, full story, every detail. They decide if it is the truth or a lie. And if they decide I'm lying..." River didn't answer immediately, his expression growing grave. "Sleep," he said instead. "Needs strength for tomorrow." Abigail lay down on the buffalo robe, its musky scent oddly comforting after days in the wilderness. Exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind raced with anxiety about the coming day. Her testimony before the council would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future relationship between the Lakota and nearby settlers. "River," she said softly into the darkness. "Thank you for bringing me here, for trusting me." There was a long pause before he replied. "You trusted first. following Lakota warriors into unknown land. I had no choice. Always choice, he countered. Could have gone to soldiers, chosen safety of your own people. Abigail considered this. He was right, of course. She had made a choice when she decided to continue with him rather than seek out the cavalry patrol. A choice that had led her here, to this teepee, to tomorrow's testimony. Sleep, River said again, his voice already heavy with approaching slumber. Tomorrow comes soon. Despite her anxiety, Abigail found herself drifting off, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the Lakota camp. Distant voices, the occasional laugh or cry of a child, dogs barking at something in the night. Different from the sounds of Pennsylvania, different from the wagon train, yet somehow containing the same essential human elements. Morning arrived with a soft touch on her shoulder. Abigail opened her eyes to find a young woman, Mourning Dove, River's niece, kneeling beside her pallet. The girl's dark eyes were serious but not unfriendly as she offered a small wooden cup of steaming liquid. "Drink," she said, her English surprisingly clear. "Give strength for counsel." Abigail sat up, accepting the cup with murmured thanks. The tea was bitter but invigorating, clearing the fog of sleep from her mind. She glanced around the teepee to find that River was already gone. "Where is your uncle?" she asked. "Speaks with elders," Mourning Dove answered, setting out a clean dress, simple in design, but carefully made from soft buckskin. "You wear your dress." She gestured at Abigail's torn and stained clothing with a slight grimace. Abigail hesitated, touched by the unexpected kindness, but uncertain about adopting Lakota dress before the council. Would it seem presumptuous, an attempt to curry favor? Mourning Dove seemed to read her thoughts. "Council respects clean appearance, shows respect back." She pointed to Abigail's matted hair. "I help with this too." Recognizing the wisdom in the young woman's advice, Abigail accepted the dress and allowed Mourning Dove to help her wash and comb her tangled hair, arranging it in a simple braid. The transformation was remarkable. The buckskin dress fit surprisingly well, and the simple act of being clean again restored something of her dignity. "Thank you," Abigail said when they had finished. "This is very kind." Mourning Dove shrugged, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Uncle says you brave woman. Help him when hurt." She touched a small beaded necklace she wore. "Strong spirit in you now." Before Abigail could respond, the hide covering the teepee entrance was pulled aside. A stern-faced warrior, one of those who had escorted them to the camp the previous evening, gestured for her to follow. "Council waits," he said gruffly. With a deep breath and a final grateful nod to Mourning Dove, Abigail stepped out to face whatever judgment awaited her. The council teepee stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others and marked with totemic symbols painted on its exterior. As Abigail approached, flanked by her stern warrior escort, she could see that a significant gathering had already assembled inside. The morning sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top, casting dappled patterns across the assembled faces. Chief Greyhawk sat at the head of the circle, his weathered face impassive. To his right was the scarred elder who had argued against her the previous evening, his single eye regarding her with undisguised suspicion. To his left sat the man with the bear claw necklace, who nodded slightly as she entered. River stood to one side, his posture formal, face carefully neutral. His arm had been freshly bandaged, and he wore a ceremonial shirt decorated with intricate beadwork. A man of standing in this community, Abigail realized, not just the solitary tracker she had come to know. "Come forward," Chief Greyhawk instructed, gesturing to the center of the circle. "Sit here." Abigail took her place on the woven mat indicated, conscious of the many eyes upon her. Women of the tribe had gathered at the periphery of the teepee, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Among them, she spotted Mourning Dove, who offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You claim to witness an Attack on a wagon train, Greyhawk began without preamble. Tell us what you saw, every detail, from the beginning. Abigail took a deep breath, centering herself. This was perhaps the most important story she would ever tell. Lives, both Lakota and settler, might depend on her ability to convey the truth convincingly. We were part of the Whitewater expedition, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. Bound for Montana territory, 15 families starting new lives. My father, James Hawkins, and I joined in Pennsylvania. She described the journey. 6 weeks on the trail, the crossing of the Missouri River, the gradual shift in landscape as they entered the plains. Then, her voice neither faltering nor over-dramatic, she recounted the horror of the massacre, the dawn attack, hiding in the tall grass, watching as the raiders systematically murdered everyone in the convoy. They were white men, she emphasized, meeting Greyhawk's steady gaze. Some wore pieces of native dress, feathers, beaded strips, but it was obviously false, a disguise. They spoke English to each other and used white men's curses. The one-eyed elder leaned forward. How do you survive when all others die? I was already away from camp when the attack began, Abigail explained. I hid in the grass, then under an overturned wagon. They were careless, confident no one had escaped, more interested in looting than searching thoroughly. She described her desperate flight, finding shelter in the bear's den, and finally encountering the same men at the trappers' camp. I heard them talking, she said, her gaze never wavering from the chiefs. They mentioned being too close to Lakota territory, and that the blame will fall on them. They were the same men who attacked us, not Indians, as they wanted it to appear. The council members exchanged glances. The man with the bear claw necklace spoke in Lakota to Greyhawk, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Abigail. These men, you know who they are? Abigail shook her head. I never saw them before the attack, but they seemed familiar with the territory. Their leader was a large man with a red beard. He called himself Jackson. A shocked silence fell over the council. Abigail glanced around, surprised, to find every face staring at her with new intensity. You know him, she said slowly, recognition dawning. Who is he? Greyhawk exchanged glances with the other elders before answering. Man you describe is Franklin Jackson. Once an army scout, now... He searched for the English word outlaw. He led an attack on a Lakota hunting party 1 moon ago. Killed many, including my brother's son. My cousin, River added quietly from where he stood. His wife also. Abigail turned to him, understanding dawning. This was why he had been tracking the raiders. Why had he been so quick to help her? Their paths had converged through shared tragedy. Jackson claims Lakota attacked settlers. Greyhawk continued. Army believes, sends soldiers, threatens war if raids continue. But it's not your people raiding, Abigail said, anger kindling within her. It's Jackson and his men creating conflict for their own profit. Yes, the chief confirmed grimly. But who believes the Lakota word against white man's? The elder with the bear claw necklace, Standing Bear, Abigail heard someone call him, spoke at length, his tone measured but forceful. Others joined in, the debate resuming with new urgency. Abigail watched their faces, wishing she could understand. Their words but reading much in their expressions and gestures. Finally, Greyhawk called for silence once more. He studied Abigail thoughtfully before speaking. Council believes your words carry truth, he announced. Story fits with what we know of Jackson. Relief washed through Abigail, so powerful she felt momentarily lightheaded. What we do not know, Greyhawk continued, is what to do with you now. Abigail hadn't considered this question in her focus on convincing the council of the truth. What would happen to her now? In the silent moment that followed Greyhawk's words, the reality of her situation struck her fully. She was a white woman alone among people who had every reason to distrust her kind. The life she had known was gone, her future uncertain at best. "I want justice," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "For my father, for the others who died, for your people who have been blamed for Jackson's crimes." "Justice is hard to find on the frontier," Greyhawk replied. "White law does not listen to Lakota." He shook his head. "And white woman who lives with Lakota, white law does not listen to her either." The truth of this statement settled heavily. In the council tipi, Abigail was caught between worlds, no longer fully part of white settler society, not truly accepted among the Lakota. Her testimony would be dismissed or discredited in both courts. "There must be a way," she insisted. "Someone who would listen, who would have the authority to investigate Jackson's gang." River, who had been silent during the latter part of the council, stepped forward. "There is one. Major William Hayes at Fort Ellis, man of honor, who has worked for fair treatment of both peoples." Several council members nodded in recognition of the name. Even the suspicious, one-eyed elder, Thunder Voice, grunted what sounded like grudging agreement. "Hayes knows Lakota speak the truth," Greyhawk confirmed. "But Fort Ellis is a 4 days journey. Dangerous path." "I'll go," Abigail said without hesitation. "I'll testify to what I saw." Her declaration caused another stir among the council. River's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or concern, possibly both. Greyhawk conferred briefly with the other elders before turning back to Abigail. "Council will consider this path. Until a decision is made, you stay in camp." His gaze was penetrating. "Show if you truly stand for truth or only for your own survival." With that, the council session ended. The elders rose, filing out of the teepee with measured dignity. The women followed, many casting curious glances at Abigail as they departed. River approached as the teepee emptied. "You did well," he said quietly. "Council rarely believes in an outsider so quickly." "What happens now?" Abigail asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional strain of reliving the massacre and facing the council. "Now we wait. Council debates, decides." He offered his hand to help her rise from the mat, "And you learn what it means to live among Lakota." As they stepped outside into the bright midday sun, Abigail realized that a new chapter of her journey was beginning. The testimony was over, but the greater challenge, finding her place in this unfamiliar world, was just starting. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm entirely foreign to Abigail's previous life. While the council deliberated on the matter of Fort Ellis, she found herself immersed in the daily patterns of Lakota existence, not as a guest or observer, but as a participant. Mourning Dove became her guide and reluctant teacher, showing Abigail how to perform the tasks expected of Lakota women. The chief's decision that she should learn their ways was being taken quite literally by the tribe. "You hold wrong," Mourning Dove said, adjusting Abigail's grip on the bone scraper she was using to prepare a deerskin. "Like this, firm but gentle, too hard damage hide, too soft leaves flesh." Abigail repositioned her hands, feeling the blisters, forming despite the calluses she had developed during her days in the wilderness. The work was physically demanding in ways she had never experienced, the constant bending, the repetitive motions, the precision required even when muscles trembled with fatigue. "In Pennsylvania," she said between strokes, "I taught reading and arithmetic to children. I spent my evenings with books or needlework." Mourning Dove looked puzzled. Books teach survival. Abigail had to admit they had not. Her education had prepared her for a life utterly different from the one she now faced. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the camp, a group of children ran past, shouting and laughing in a game of chase. One small boy, perhaps 4 years old, stumbled and fell heavily, scraping his knee on a stone. Instead of crying, he pushed himself up, brushed off the dirt, and rejoined the game with barely a wince. Lakota children learn early, Mourning Dove commented following Abigail's gaze. Pain is teacher, weakness not honored. In my world, mothers rush to comfort crying children, Abigail said. We protect them from pain when we can. Mourning Dove's expression turned thoughtful. Different ways, not wrong, just different. Here, children must be strong to survive. She returned to her work. Like you must be strong now. The observation struck Abigail more deeply than Mourning Dove likely intended. Strength in this world was measured differently, not by social graces or intellectual achievements, but by one's ability to endure, to contribute, to survive. By midday, they joined the other women at the cooking fires. Abigail's hands were raw, her back aching, but she felt a strange sense of accomplishment in the properly prepared hide, in the skills, however rudimentary, she was beginning to acquire. Some of the women still regarded her with suspicion, keeping their distance and speaking Lakota when she was near, clearly discussing her. Others had begun to accept her presence with grudging tolerance, occasionally correcting her technique or offering small nods of approval when she managed a task correctly. 1. Elderly woman, White Feather, had taken a particular interest in Abigail, though she spoke no English. She communicated through gestures and expressions, showing Abigail which plants could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, which were to be avoided. She lost daughter to white man's sickness, Mourning Dove explained when Abigail asked about the old woman's attention. Thinks you were sent to learn her knowledge before she joins your ancestors. The responsibility of this unexpected mentorship weighed on Abigail. These were not simple cooking tips or housekeeping skills being shared. They were survival knowledge accumulated over generations, sacred in their way. Throughout these days of learning, River remained a distant figure. She caught glimpses of him in council meetings, training with younger warriors, and departing on hunting expeditions. When their paths did cross, he acknowledged her with a nod or brief greeting, but the easy companionship of their journey seemed to have evaporated within the confines of the camp. The evening of her 4th day among the Lakota, Abigail sat alone outside her teepee, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A small carved animal, a bear that White Feather had given her that morning, rested in her palm, its smooth surface warm from her touch. Bear Spirit speaks to you. River's voice came from behind her, surprising Abigail with its suddenness. He moved silently, even in camp. I don't know about spirits, she admitted as he sat beside her on a fallen log, but it reminds me that I'm stronger than I once believed. River nodded, his gaze on the horizon. Council finishes discussion tomorrow. Decision comes about Fort Ellis. Abigail's heart quickened. Have they given any indication of their thinking? Divided. Some say the risk too great. Jackson's men watch trails. Army patrols suspicious of Lakota. He glanced at her. Others say, truth must be told, no matter the danger. I still wish to go, she said without hesitation. For justice, for your cousin's family, for mine. A moment of silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way their recent interactions had not. Why have you been avoiding me? Abigail asked finally, the question that had been troubling her for days. River's expression remained carefully neutral. Not avoiding, giving space. Here you are, white woman in a Lakota camp, different from a woman alone in the wilderness. He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. Some watch how I treat you, judge both of us by this. Understanding dawned slowly. Their closeness on the journey, born of necessity and shared danger, carried different implications within. The social structure of the camp, River's position, his respect among his people, could be compromised by appearing too attached to an outsider. "I see," Abigail said softly. "I wouldn't want to cause problems for you here." "Not a problem," River corrected. "Complication. Different." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the camp's edge. Warriors were gathering, weapons in hand, responding to something beyond Abigail's view. River rose immediately, alert and tense. "Stay here," he instructed, already moving toward the disturbance. Abigail hesitated only briefly before following at a discreet distance. Whatever was happening might affect her as well, and she was tired of being sheltered from difficult truths. At the camp's perimeter, a small group of warriors surrounded a kneeling figure, a white man, bloodied and bound, his face a mass of bruises. Chief Greyhawk stood before him, expression grave, as Thunder Voice reported something in rapid Lakota. "Found near creek that bends," River translated quietly for Abigail, who had come to stand beside him despite his instructions. "Watching camp. When caught, tried to fight." The captive raised his head, revealing a face that made Abigail gasp with recognition despite the injuries. She knew him, one of Jackson's men, the youngest of the raiders she had glimpsed at their camp. Greyhawk turned at her reaction. "You know this man?" "Yes," Abigail confirmed, stepping forward. "He was with the raiders, one of Jackson's gang." A ripple of tension passed through the gathered Lakota. The captive's eyes widened as he recognized Abigail. "You're dead," he rasped, disbelief evident beneath his fear. "You died in the wagons with the rest." "Clearly not," Abigail replied coldly. "Unlike my father, unlike the children your gang murdered." Greyhawk addressed the captive in halting English. "Why do you watch our camp?" The young raider's gaze darted between the armed warriors surrounding him. "Jackson sent me," he said, desperation loosening his tongue. "Said to find the Indian who's been picking us off, the one who took Mills with an arrow, and to look for any survivors from the wagon train." "How did Jackson know to look here?" River demanded. "Army patrol," the captive replied. "They reported seeing a white woman with an Indian brave heading north. Jackson figured it had to be the one that got away." Abigail felt a chill run through her. Jackson knew she had survived, knew she was a witness to his crimes, and now knew exactly where to find her. Greyhawk spoke rapidly to the council members who had joined the gathering. The debate was brief but intense, concluding with a sharp nod from the chief. "Take him to Council Tippy," he ordered. "We learn what else he knows." As the warriors hauled the captive away, Greyhawk turned to Abigail and River. "This changes path. Ahead. Jackson now hunts both of you, knows you can tell the truth of his crimes. All the more reason to reach Fort Ellis," Abigail argued, "before he silences us permanently." Greyhawk studied her with newfound respect. "You have the courage of a Lakota woman, even in white skin." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Council meets now, not tomorrow. Decision cannot wait with the enemy so close." The chief strode toward the council teepee, calling for the elders to join him. River moved to follow, then paused, turning back to Abigail. "Stay in your teepee," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument this time. "Guards outside. I will return when the council finishes." Abigail wanted to protest, but recognized the genuine concern in his eyes. This was not about keeping her away from tribal matters, but about protecting her from very real danger. She nodded her agreement and headed back to her small dwelling, her decision about Fort Ellis now carrying even greater urgency. The council's deliberations lasted well into the night. Abigail sat in her teepee, listening to the muffled sounds of the camp, hushed conversations outside, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft lullaby a mother sang to quiet her child. Despite the ordinary nature of these sounds, there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present before. The capture of Jackson's scout had changed everything. 2 young warriors stood guard outside her dwelling, their silhouettes occasionally visible against the hide walls when they moved. Their presence was both reassuring and unsettling. Protection, yes, but also a reminder of the danger that had followed her to this place. Mourning Dove had departed after arranging protective fetishes at the teepee entrance, small bundles of herbs and feathers that she explained would ward off evil. Whether they worked or not, the gesture was touching. "Uncle will protect you," Mourning Dove had said with absolute certainty. "He has seen your spirit." Abigail had looked up sharply at this. "What do you mean?" Mourning Dove seemed surprised by the question. "You do not know. In our ways, when a person saves another from death, spirits are joined. When you killed a bear that would take his life, your spirit spoke to him." She fingered the bear carving Abigail had set beside her sleeping pallet. "This is powerful medicine between warriors." The implications of this cultural belief settled over Abigail like a blanket, both comforting and weighty with responsibility. In River's worldview, they were connected not just by circumstance or mutual aid, but by something deeper, something spiritual. It was well past midnight when the hide covering her teepee entrance was pushed aside. River ducked inside, his expression grave in the dim light of the small fire. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "Council has decided," he said without preamble, settling cross-legged before the fire. Abigail sat up straighter, heart quickening. "What will happen?" "Many things." River added a small stick to the fire, watching the flames catch. "Camp moves. At dawn, deeper into Lakota territory, harder to find. Women, children, and elders go north to summer hunting grounds by a great lake." "And us?" Abigail asked, noting his phrasing. River met her gaze directly. "We go to Fort Ellis. You, me, 4 warriors. Try to reach Major Hayes before Jackson finds us." Relief and anxiety washed through Abigail in equal measure. The council had agreed to her plan, but the journey would be perilous with Jackson actively hunting them. What about the raider, the one who was caught? A shadow crossed River's face. He gave information, names of others in Jackson's gang, location of their camp, plans to blame the next raid on the Crow tribe to the south. He paused. He will not return to Jackson. Abigail didn't press for details, understanding the implication. The young raider had met tribal justice for his crimes against the Lakota people. "When do we leave?" "Before dawn. Secret path. Need to travel light, fast." River produced a small bundle from his pack. "Brought these for your journey." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal moccasins made of soft deer hide decorated with subtle beadwork. "White feather made for you. Better than boots for quiet travel." Abigail accepted the gift, touched by the elderly woman's thoughtfulness. "Please thank her for me." "Thank yourself. She says you learn well for white woman." A hint of amusement flickered in River's eyes. High praise from a Lakota woman. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, packing only essential supplies, reviewing the route they would take, discussing contingencies if they encountered trouble. It was a grim but necessary conversation, both of them acutely aware of the stakes. "Rest now," River said finally. "Need strength for days ahead." Abigail nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with her mind racing. As River rose to leave, she called after him, "What did the council learn about Jackson's whereabouts? How close is he?" River hesitated, clearly debating whether to share this information. "1 day's ride southwest, camp near a trading post called Morgan's Crossing." "So close," Abigail whispered, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. "Yes. Why do we leave different directions? Use Lakota paths through hills?" He studied her face. "Are you afraid?" It would have been easy to lie, to pretend bravery she didn't entirely feel, but Abigail had learned that honesty between them was more valuable than pride. "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to turn back." Fear is useful only if it makes you act, River said, echoing Abigail's own father's teaching. Good fear makes feet quick, eyes sharp. Bad fear makes your heart freeze. He adjusted his pack. Your fear is good. With that assessment he departed, leaving Abigail to prepare herself for what might be the most dangerous journey of her life. Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with pursuing shadows and the echoing sound of gunfire. Abigail woke before the designated hour, her body tense with anticipation. Outside, the camp was stirring with quiet purpose. Families preparing for their own journey north, warriors readying weapons and horses. The 4 warriors who would accompany them to Fort Ellis were already gathered at the edge of the clearing when Abigail arrived. Standing Bear, the elder with the bear claw necklace. Swift Fox, a middle-aged warrior known for his tracking skills. 2 wolves, younger than the others, but renowned for his endurance. And to Abigail's surprise, Thunder Voice, the one-eyed elder who had been most skeptical of her testimony. Thunder Voice comes? She asked River quietly as she approached. His. And Joyce, River replied, says old eyes see the truth others miss, good tracker before injury. Chief Greyhawk appeared as they prepared to depart, his weathered face solemn in the early light. He spoke briefly to each warrior in Lakota, clasping their forearms in a gesture of respect and farewell. When he came to Abigail, he switched to English. You carry Lakota truth now, he said gravely. Heavy burden for any shoulders. Heavier, for woman alone between worlds. I'm not alone, Abigail replied, glancing at River and the others. Greyhawk nodded, approval warming his dark eyes. No, not alone. He pressed something into her hand, a small carved token bearing symbols she didn't recognize. Show this to Hayes. He knows Greyhawk's mark. He raised his hand in a gesture of blessing. Now go, speak with a straight tongue. With these final words of guidance, the small party mounted their horses, Abigail somewhat awkwardly as she was, still adapting to riding bareback in the Lakota fashion. As they rode away from the camp, Abigail glanced back once at the community that had sheltered her, however briefly. Women were dismantling teepees, children helping to pack belongings. Elderly, members directing the work with practiced authority. Despite the urgency of their evacuation, there was no panic, no chaos, just the efficient movement of a people accustomed to mobility and change. River guided their small party toward a narrow trail that wound through dense woodlands, moving at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting their mounts. The warriors remained vigilant, eyes constantly scanning the terrain, hands never far from weapons. Abigail rode beside River, her body gradually adjusting to the rhythm of horseback travel. As they entered a small clearing, Thunder Voice, riding ahead, called something back in Lakota. River tensed, his hand moving to his knife. "What is it?" Abigail asked, alarm rising. "Fresh tracks crossing our path ahead," River translated. "Shod. Horses, not Lakota." The group halted as Thunder Voice and Swift Fox dismounted to examine the trail. Their discussion was rapid and intense, punctuated by gestures toward the west and south. 6 riders, River explained quietly to Abigail. Passed. This morning, heavy horses, deep prints. His expression darkened. Army patrol, or Jackson. Standing Bear rejoined them, speaking urgently to River, who nodded grimly. Change of path, he told Abigail. Tracks head south toward the main trail. We go east first, then circle back. As they altered course, heading into denser woodland that would shield them from distant observers, Abigail felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on her shoulders. She was no longer just a survivor, but a witness, a potential instrument of justice, perhaps even a bridge between 2 worlds, locked in a cycle of suspicion and violence. With the carved bear tucked safely in her pocket, and Greyhawk's token secured in the medicine pouch River had given her, Abigail Hawkins, once a schoolteacher's daughter bound for Montana, rode deeper into a future she could never have imagined, toward a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but perhaps the fate of peace on this contested frontier. 3 days of hard riding had brought them to within a day's journey of Fort Ellis. Their path had taken them through terrain few white settlers ever witnessed, hidden valleys where elk and antelope grazed undisturbed, ancient ceremonial grounds marked by standing stones, pristine lakes nestled in the embrace of forested hills. Despite the beauty, the journey had been tense. Twice they had spotted distant riders and been forced to seek cover until the strangers passed. Once, in the dark of night, they had frozen in place as a large contingent of mounted men, too many to count in the darkness, had passed less than half a mile from their hidden camp. "Jackson gathers men," Thunder Voice had observed grimly after. "The riders passed. Prepares something big. More reason to reach Hayes quickly," River had replied, but Abigail had noted the concern in his eyes. Now, as they made camp on the evening of the 3rd day, the atmosphere among the small group was one of tightly controlled tension. They were close, tantalizingly close to their destination, but the final approach to the fort would be the most dangerous part of their journey. "Tomorrow we separate," River announced, as they gathered around the small, carefully banked fire. Standing Bear knows Hayes. He and Abigail approach the fort from east. At dawn, show token from Greyhawk, request a meeting with the Major. "And you?" Abigail asked, not liking the direction of his plan. "Rest of us watch from hills, make sure there is no trap." She wanted to object, to insist they stay together, but the logic was undeniable. A lone white woman with one elderly Lakota warrior might gain entrance to the fort. 5 armed Lakota men, approaching with a white woman, would likely meet a very different reception. What if Hayes isn't there? The possibility had troubled her thoughts throughout their journey. Or doesn't. "Believe us?" "Standing Bear has known Hayes for many seasons," Swift Fox said, his English better than Abigail had realized. "Major is fair man. We'll listen." As the others prepared for sleep, Abigail found herself studying the stars overhead, the same stars she had gazed at as a child in Pennsylvania, the same stars that had guided the Lakota for countless generations. So much bloodshed beneath their steady light, so many misunderstandings and betrayals. "Cannot sleep?" River's voice came quietly beside her. Abigail shook her head. "Thinking about tomorrow, about what comes after." She hesitated, then voiced the question that had been forming in her mind for days. "If we succeed, if Hayes believes us and arrests Jackson, what then? Where do I go? I have no family left, no home." River was silent for a long moment, his face half hidden in shadow. "Many paths open before you. Could return east, start a new life. Could go west, still reach Montana settlements. And if I wanted to stay," the words emerged before she had fully formed the thought. "With the Lakota, I mean. With—" she hesitated. "With you." His eyes found hers in the darkness, searching. "Hard path. Between worlds is a lonely place." "I'm already between worlds," Abigail said softly. "Have been since the day you found me." River nodded slowly. "True. But the choice must wait until after tomorrow." His voice firmed. "First, justice." "First, justice," Abigail agreed, though her heart continued to ponder the question long after they had retired to their separate sleeping places. Dawn broke crisp and clear, the eastern sky painted in bands of gold and crimson. Abigail and Standing Bear prepared to depart, securing minimal provisions for the final approach to the fort, which lay approximately 5 miles east over open prairie. River handed Abigail a folded piece of rough paper, a crude but effective map. "If there is trouble at fort, follow this. Leads to a meeting place here." He indicated a spot along a river bend. We wait until sunset. If you do not come, we follow." Abigail nodded, tucking the map securely inside her jacket. The unspoken message was clear. If things went wrong, they would attempt to rescue regardless of the risk. As she mounted her horse, River approached, placing his hand briefly on her arm. "Bear walks with you," he said quietly, "and so do I, in spirit." The simple farewell carried more weight than any elaborate goodbye could have. Abigail covered his hand with hers for a moment, then turned her horse to follow Standing Bear toward the rising sun. They had traveled less than 2 miles when Standing Bear suddenly raised his hand in warning, pulling his horse to a stop behind a small copse of trees. Abigail followed suit, her heart racing as she heard what had alerted him, the unmistakable sound of many horses approaching from the south. "Down!" Standing Bear hissed, sliding from his mount. "Hide horses!" They pulled their mounts deeper into the trees, tying them hurriedly before crawling to the edge of the small grove. From their vantage point they could see a dust cloud moving rapidly along the main trail that paralleled their position, perhaps half a mile away. As the riders came into view, Abigail felt her blood run cold. There were at least 20 men, heavily armed, riding hard toward the fort. At their head was a figure she recognized instantly despite the distance, a large man with a red beard, Jackson. "They go to the fort," Standing Bear whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Why?" The answer came to Abigail in a flash of horrible clarity. "They know we're coming. The captured scout. He must have told them our plan before he was killed. They're going to reach the fort before us." Standing Bear's weathered face grew grave. "If Jackson speaks first to army, tells lies, they'll be waiting for us," Abigail finished. "We'd be riding into a trap." The old warrior considered for a moment, then gestured for her to follow him back to the horses. "Must warn others. New plan is needed." They mounted quickly and rode back the way they had come, pushing their horses as fast as they dared through the rough terrain. When they reached the camp, River and the others were already alert, having spotted their hasty return. "Jackson," Abigail said before anyone could speak, 20 men heading for the fort. They must know we're coming." River's expression darkened. "Scout told them before death. My fault. Should have questioned more before council justice." "No time for blame," Thunder Voice cut in. "Need new path now." They gathered around as River sketched a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Fort here. Jackson approaches from the south. We are here. Could still reach Hayes," Standing Bear suggested. "Go north, circle wide, enter the fort from different direction." "Too slow," Swift Fox argued. "Jackson will have hours to poison the army's mind against us." "What if we don't go to the fort at all?" Abigail interjected. All eyes turned to her. "What do you mean?" River asked. "Hayes is army, must follow rules, gather evidence, process." She pointed to the map. "But Jackson is here now, in the open, away from the fort." Understanding dawned in River's eyes. "You suggest we confront Jackson directly? 5 against 20, not good odds." "Not confront in battle," Abigail clarified. "Intercept, capture. Then bring him to Hayes. With the bandit leader himself as evidence, Hayes would have to listen." The warriors exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Dangerous," River said finally, "but it's possible." He pointed to a spot on his crude map. "Trail passes through a narrow valley here. Good place for ambush." The plan came together quickly. They would ride ahead to the valley, position themselves on the ridges above. When Jackson and his men entered the narrow passage, they would spring their trap, not to kill but to isolate Jackson from his men and capture him alive. "Woman stays back," Thunder Voice insisted as they prepared to leave. "Too dangerous." "No," Abigail said firmly, checking the pistol she had carried since River had given it to her after the incident with the trapper. "My testimony condemns him. I need to be there." River studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "She comes, stays with me." They rode hard, taking a game trail that Swift Fox knew would bring them to the valley well ahead of Jackson's party. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached, steep ridges flanking a narrow passage where the trail was forced between towering rock walls. "Perfect place for ambush," two wolves observed as they surveyed the valley from above. "No escape to the sides, must go forward or back." They positioned themselves strategically, Thunder Voice and Swift Fox on the northern ridge, Standing Bear and two wolves on the southern. River and Abigail took position at the eastern end of the valley, where the passage widened again. "When Jackson reaches the center," River explained as they crouched behind a fallen tree, "others startle horses from above. Not attack, just frighten. Create confusion. In chaos we take Jackson." "And if his men fight back?" Abigail asked, the reality of what they were attempting beginning to sink in. River's expression was grim. "Then we fight too, but aim is capture, not kill. Justice needs a living witness." They didn't have long to wait. Less than an hour later, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs as the first riders came into view, entering the narrow passage from the west. Jackson rode third in line, his red beard visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He was laughing at something one of his men said, utterly unaware of the trap about to be sprung. When the entire party had entered the valley, River gave a signal, a bird call that echoed off the rock walls. Instantly, Thunder Voice and Swift Fox began dislodging rocks from the ridge, sending them tumbling down behind the last riders, while Standing Bear and two wolves did the same ahead of the lead horses. The effect was instantaneous. Horses reared and bucked in panic as stones crashed down around them. Men shouted in confusion, some thrown from their mounts, others struggling to control terrified animals. In the chaos, River and Abigail mounted and rode straight toward Jackson, who had managed to stay on his horse but was separated from most of his men by the panicking animals between them. Jackson saw them coming and reacted with surprising speed, drawing his pistol and firing at River. The shot went wide, but it alerted his men to the real threat. Several turned their attention from the falling rocks to the two riders charging toward their leader. "There!" one shouted. "It's the Indian and the girl." Jackson's face contorted with rage and recognition. "Kill the redskin!" he bellowed. "The woman's mine!" Bullets whizzed past them as River and Abigail closed the distance. From the ridges above, arrows rained down with precision, not killing but striking arms and legs, disabling without fatal wounds. In the melee, Abigail lost sight of River. Her horse pushed forward through the chaos, bringing her face to face with Jackson himself, his pistol leveled at her chest, his eyes wild with hatred. "Should have made sure you were dead at the wagons, girl," he snarled. Before he could pull the trigger, Abigail's own pistol was in her hand, the lesson of the bear fresh in her mind. She fired without hesitation. Jackson jerked backward, his shoulder blossoming red where her bullet struck. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as he lost his grip, sliding sideways from his saddle. Abigail's horse reared as gunfire continued around them. She clung to its mane, struggling to stay mounted amid the chaos. When she regained control, she saw River on foot, locked in hand-to-hand combat with Jackson, who, despite his wounded shoulder, fought with desperate strength. The other warriors had descended from the ridges and were engaged with Jackson's men, the battle spreading across the valley floor. It was impossible to tell who was winning in the swirling dust and confusion. Abigail dismounted, searching for a way to help River. Jackson had drawn a knife and was slashing wildly, forcing River to dodge and weave to avoid the blade. Blood streaked River's arm where he'd already been caught once. Without conscious thought, Abigail picked up a fallen branch, heavy as a club, and circled behind the fighting men. When Jackson lunged forward again, she swung with all her strength, connecting solidly with the back of his head. The bandit leader crumpled instantly, falling face first into the dirt. River looked up, momentarily stunned. then gave Abigail a grim nod of thanks before quickly binding Jackson's hands behind his back. Around them, the battle was subsiding. Several of Jackson's men were down, wounded but alive. Others had fled, escaping back the way they had come. The Lakota warriors had suffered injuries as well. Standing Bear clutched a bloodied arm, and Swift Fox limped badly, but all were standing. "We have him," River said, hauling the unconscious Jackson upright. "Now we go to the fort with proof." They bound the captured bandits to their horses and set off toward Fort Ellis, their strange procession moving at a careful pace to accommodate the wounded. Abigail rode beside River, who led Jackson's horse with the semi-conscious bandit tied securely to the saddle. "You fought well," River said quietly as the fort appeared on the horizon. "Bear spirit strong in you." Abigail glanced at him, seeing beyond the calm exterior to the pride and something else in his eyes. "I had a good teacher." The fort sentries spotted them long before they reached the gates. A warning bugle sounded, and they could see soldiers rushing to defensive positions along the walls. "Slow now," River cautioned. "No sudden moves." When they were within hailing distance, Abigail rode forward alone, her hands visible and empty. "I am Abigail Hawkins," she called up to the wary faces on the wall, "survivor of the Whitewater Massacre. We have captured Franklin Jackson, the man responsible. We seek justice from Major Hayes." There was a moment of confused consultation among the soldiers before the gates opened, and a contingent rode out to meet them. At their head was a tall, stern-faced officer with silver at his temples. "I am Major William Hayes," he announced, his gaze moving from Abigail to the bound prisoners, then to the wounded Lakota warriors. "This is most irregular." Abigail reached into her jacket and produced Greyhawk's token. "Chief Greyhawk sends greetings. He says you know his mark, and that you are a man who listens to the truth no matter who speaks it." Hayes took the token, examining it carefully before tucking it into his pocket. "I know Greyhawk, a man of honor." His eyes narrowed as he studied Jackson's bloody, defiant face. "And I know of Franklin Jackson. His reputation is considerably less honorable. He led the attack on our wagon train," Abigail said firmly. "Murdered 15 settlers, including my father, then blamed it on the Lakota to cover his crimes. He's been raiding both settlers and native hunting parties, deliberately inciting conflict between our peoples." "Lies," Jackson spat, struggling. "Against his bonds. This woman's been turned by savages. Can't believe a word." "Be silent," Hayes cut him off sharply. He turned back to Abigail. "Do you have evidence of these claims beyond your word?" "I witnessed the massacre personally," Abigail replied. "And these men," she gestured to the Lakota warriors, "can testify to attacks on their people that were blamed on settlers. Jackson's other men, those who escaped, can be captured and questioned. The truth will come out." Hayes considered this for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Bring the prisoners inside. We'll get statements from everyone." He glanced at the Lakota warriors. "All of you are welcome inside the fort under my personal protection." As they passed through the gates of Fort Ellis, Abigail felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The journey wasn't over. There would be questions, testimonies, legal proceedings, but Jackson was captured. The truth would be heard. And for the first time since the massacre, justice seemed possible. 3 weeks later, Abigail stood on the crest of a hill overlooking the prairie, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Fort Ellis lay behind her, its walls now a place of safety rather than uncertainty. Hayes had been true to his word. Jackson and his captured men had been thoroughly questioned, their contradicting stories unraveling under the major's skilled interrogation. Evidence had been gathered, witnesses called, and justice set in motion. Jackson would hang for his crimes, his surviving men sentenced to long years in territorial prison. More importantly, Hayes had sent official dispatches to Army Command, clearing the Lakota of blame for the raids and recommending renewed peace talks with Greyhawk and other chiefs. It wasn't a perfect solution to the complex problems of the frontier, but it was a step toward truth, toward understanding. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Abigail turned to see River approaching. He looked different in the fading light. Less guarded, perhaps, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Hayes says official papers are ready," he said as he reached her side. "Your testimony is written, signed, justice done." "As much as it can be," Abigail replied softly. The dead wouldn't return, the pain wouldn't vanish, but something had been accomplished, something important. "You decide," River asked after a moment of silence. "What path do you take now?" Hayes had offered to arrange passage east for her, a return to civilization, to what remained of her old life. There were distant cousins in Philadelphia who might take her in, a chance to rebuild something familiar. Abigail's hand went to her pocket, where the carved bear still resided. "I have." She turned to face River fully. "The way I see it, there are two kinds of people in this world, those who build walls and those who build bridges. My father taught for 30 years, trying to build bridges through education. The least I can do is continue that work in my own way." River's expression remained careful, neutral. "Meaning, Hayes has offered me a position here as a translator and cultural liaison between the fort and the Lakota. He says someone who understands both worlds is valuable." She studied River's face, looking for his reaction. "I would live here but travel regularly to the Lakota camps, learn more of your language, your ways, help prevent misunderstandings like the ones Jackson exploited." Slowly, the careful mask slipped from River's features, revealing a quiet joy that reached his eyes. "Bridge builder," he said thoughtfully. "Good path, hard path." "Most worthwhile things are," Abigail replied, "and I wouldn't be walking it alone. Hayes has asked you to serve as a scout and liaison as well, if you're willing." River looked out over the prairie toward the distant hills where his people's summer camp would now be established. "My father was a scout, tried to build a bridge, failed." His eyes found hers again. "Maybe his son does better with the right partner." Abigail felt something warm unfurl in her chest, like the first tentative bloom of spring after a harsh winter. "Partners," she agreed. Then, as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had nearly claimed her life but had instead given her a new purpose, Abigail Hawkins, survivor, witness, bridge builder, stood beside River Wolf and faced the future together. The carved bear rested between them, a symbol of the path they had traveled and the one that stretched before them, a path that would never be easy, but would always be true. The lone survivor of a wagon train massacre and the Lakota tracker, who had found her when she had nothing left but the will to survive, had discovered something unexpected amid the shadows of the frontier. A shared destiny, a common purpose, and the courage to walk between worlds. As the last light faded from the sky, Abigail remembered something her father had often said: "The strongest bridges are built by those who have stood on both shores." In her unlikely journey from schoolteacher's daughter to cultural intermediary, from victim to advocate, she had found not just survival, but purpose, not just a future, but a home. And in a world divided by misunderstanding and violence, perhaps, that was the greatest justice of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Abigail's horse reared as gunfire continued around them. She clung to its mane, struggling to stay mounted amid the chaos. When she regained control, she saw River on foot, locked in hand-to-hand combat with Jackson, who, despite his wounded shoulder, Fought with desperate strength, the other warriors had descended from the ridges and were engaged with Jackson's men, the battle spreading across the valley floor. It was impossible to tell who was winning in the swirling dust and confusion. Abigail dismounted, searching for a way to help River. Jackson had drawn a knife and was slashing wildly, forcing River to dodge and weave to avoid the blade. Blood streaked River's arm where he'd already been caught once. Without conscious thought, Abigail picked up a fallen branch, heavy as a club, and circled behind the fighting men. When Jackson lunged forward again, she swung with all her strength, connecting solidly with the back of his head. The bandit leader crumpled instantly, falling face first into the dirt. River looked up, momentarily stunned, then gave Abigail a grim nod of thanks before quickly binding Jackson's hands behind his back. Around them, the battle was subsiding. Several of Jackson's men were down, wounded but alive. Others had fled, escaping back the way they had come. The Lakota warriors had suffered injuries as well. Standing Bear clutched a bloodied arm, and Swift Fox limped badly, but all were standing. "We have him," River said, hauling the unconscious Jackson upright. "Now we go to the fort with proof." They bound the captured bandits to their horses and set off toward Fort Ellis, their strange procession moving at a careful pace to accommodate the wounded. Abigail rode beside River, who led Jackson's horse with the semi-conscious bandit tied securely to the saddle. "You fought well," River said quietly as the fort appeared on the horizon. "Bear spirit strong in you." Abigail glanced at him, seeing beyond the calm exterior to the pride and something else in his eyes. "I had a good teacher." The fort sentries spotted them long before they reached the gates. A warning bugle sounded, and they could see soldiers rushing to defensive positions along the walls. "Slow now," River cautioned. "No sudden moves." When they were within hailing distance, Abigail rode forward alone, her hands visible and empty. "I am Abigail Hawkins," she called up to the wary faces on the wall, "survivor of the Wagon Massacre. We have captured Franklin Jackson, the man responsible. We seek justice from Major Hayes." There was a moment of confused consultation among the soldiers before the gates opened, and a contingent rode out to meet them. At their head was a tall, stern-faced officer with silver at his temples. "I am Major William Hayes," he announced, his gaze moving from Abigail to the bound prisoners, then to the wounded Lakota warriors. "This is most irregular." Abigail reached into her jacket and produced Greyhawk's token. "Chief Greyhawk sends greetings. He says you know his mark, and that you are a man who listens to the truth no matter who speaks it." Hayes took the token, examining it carefully before tucking it into his pocket. "I know Greyhawk, a man of honor." His eyes narrowed as he studied Jackson's bloody, defiant face. "And I know of Franklin Jackson. His reputation is considerably less honorable. He led the attack on our wagon train," Abigail said firmly. "Murdered 15 settlers, including my father, then blamed it on the Lakota to cover his crimes. He's been raiding both settlers and native hunting parties, deliberately inciting conflict between our peoples." "Lies," Jackson spat, struggling. "Against his bonds. This woman's been turned by savages. Can't believe a word. Be silent." Hayes cut him off sharply. He turned back to Abigail. "Do you have evidence of these claims beyond your word?" "I witnessed the massacre personally," Abigail replied. "And these men," she gestured to the Lakota warriors, "can testify to attacks on their people that were blamed on settlers. Jackson's other men, those who escaped, can be captured and questioned. The truth will come out." Hayes considered this for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Bring the prisoners inside. We'll get statements from everyone." He glanced at the Lakota warriors. "All of you are welcome inside the fort under my personal protection." As they passed through the gates of Fort Ellis, Abigail felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The journey wasn't over. There would be questions, testimonies, legal proceedings, but Jackson was captured. The truth would be heard. And for the first time since the massacre, Justice seemed possible. 3 weeks later, Abigail stood on the crest of a hill overlooking the prairie, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Fort Ellis lay behind her, its walls now a place of safety rather than uncertainty. Hayes had been true to his word. Jackson and his captured men had been thoroughly questioned, their contradicting stories unraveling under the major's skilled interrogation. Evidence had been gathered, witnesses called, and justice set in motion. Jackson would hang for his crimes, his surviving men sentenced to long years in territorial prison. More importantly, Hayes had sent official dispatches to Army Command, clearing the Lakota of blame for the raids and recommending renewed peace talks with Greyhawk and other chiefs. It wasn't a perfect solution to the complex problems of the frontier, but it was a step toward truth, toward understanding. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Abigail turned to see River approaching. He looked different in the fading light. Less guarded, perhaps, now that the immediate danger had passed. Hayes says official papers are ready, he said as he reached her side. Your testimony is written, signed, justice done. As much as it can be, Abigail replied softly. The dead wouldn't return, the pain wouldn't vanish, but something had been accomplished, something important. You decide, River asked after a moment of silence. What path do you take now? Hayes had offered to arrange passage east for her, a return to civilization, to what remained of her old life. There were distant cousins in Philadelphia who might take her in, a chance to rebuild something familiar. Abigail's hand went to her pocket, where the carved bear still resided. I have. She turned to face River fully. The way I see it, there are two kinds of people in this world, those who build walls and those who build bridges. My father taught for 30 years, trying to build bridges through education. The least I can do is continue that work in my own way. River's expression remained careful, neutral. Meaning, Hayes has offered me a position here as a translator and cultural liaison between the fort and the Lakota. He says someone who understands both worlds is valuable. She studied River's face, looking for his reaction. I would live here but travel regularly to the Lakota camps, learn more of your language, your ways, help prevent misunderstandings like the ones Jackson exploited. Slowly, the careful mask slipped from River's features, revealing a quiet joy that reached his eyes. Bridge builder, he said thoughtfully. Good path, hard path. Most worthwhile things are, Abigail replied, and I wouldn't be walking it alone. Hayes has asked you to serve as a scout and liaison as well, if you're willing. River looked out over the prairie toward the distant hills where his people's summer camp would now be established. My father was a scout, tried to build a bridge, failed. His eyes found hers again. Maybe his son does better with the right partner. Abigail felt something warm unfurl in her chest, like the first tentative bloom of spring after a harsh winter. Partners, she agreed. Then, as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had nearly claimed her life but had instead given her a new purpose, Abigail Hawkins, survivor, witness, bridge builder, stood beside River Wolf and faced the future together. The carved bear rested between them, a symbol of the path they had traveled and the one that stretched before them, a path that would never be easy, but would always be true. The lone survivor of a wagon train massacre and the Lakota tracker, who had found her when she had nothing left but the will to survive, had discovered something unexpected amid the shadows of the frontier. A shared destiny, a common purpose, and the courage to walk between worlds. As the last light faded from the sky, Abigail remembered something her father had often said: the strongest bridges are built by those who have stood on both shores. In her unlikely journey from schoolteacher's daughter to cultural intermediary, from victim to advocate, she had found not just survival, but purpose, not just a future, but a home. And in a world divided by misunderstanding and violence, perhaps, that was the greatest justice of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.